During the process of making a new game, there's an almost inconceivable number of ways something can go wrong, ranging from the initial concept of the title being heavily flawed from the get-go, all the way to the final product just not being very good. But I'd argue the worst point in the development cycle you can fail at is the marketing. After all, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how good the work is if you can't convince anyone to actually play it. Naturally, this has led to some memorable campaigns that undoubtedly played roles in some of the industry's biggest triumphs. But for every success story, like Genesis does what Nintendo don't, or the Halo 3 Believe ads, you've got just as many failures, whether it be Sony staging a goat sacrifice for God of War 2, or THQ polluting San Francisco with hundreds of red balloons to promote Homefront. So today, I wanted to cover the campaigns that were not only failures, but in some cases backfired so horribly that their infamy not only dragged what they were advertising down with it, but arguably outlived whatever it was they were trying to promote. So strap yourself in as I showcase to you terrible ads, mismanaged contests, and horrendous publicity stunts that royally screwed over the products they were trying to sell. These are the biggest failures of gaming marketing campaigns. Let's start things off with a contest that fell apart due to sheer incompetence, with 1992's Action 52 for the NES. The title being the end result of 4 people getting 3 months to make a legal version of one of those bootleg multi-carts that swamp the retro game market, with the title often being regarded as one of the worst games on the NES, owing to the fact that all 52 games featured are terrible, either due to the awful controls and nonsensical gameplay elements, being impossible to win or lose some of the games, and in a few cases, because the game just crashes as soon as you try to start playing them. With all of these things being made worse by the fact that the game retailed for $199 US. That's the equivalent of over $460 today, meaning this barely functional piece of crap, which features titles like Lollipops, Mash Man, and They Came, was being sold for what was effectively the same price as a Switch 2. $200 to see a giant invincible tank fight bootleg Saddam Hussein. Based on that summary, you might be wondering, who could possibly be dumb enough to even consider buying this? Well, maybe you'd be convinced when you heard about the competition the game was tied to. Namely, the developers were offering a $52,000 cash prize and a $52,000 scholarship for whoever could beat the 5th game on the cartridge, titled Ooze, and send a picture of the final screen as proof. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, unfortunately, no one ended up winning the contest. Not because it was ridiculously hard or something, but owing to a bug, the game would always crash without fail during level 3, meaning it's impossible to beat or even reach the final level, in turn making the contest unwinnable. So if you bought this, you were not only scammed out of $200 for a collection of software so poor in quality that even calling them games is an insult to the entire medium, you were also scammed out of the chance to win over $100 grand thanks to the developers rushing this crap out as soon as possible, helping to further cement Action 52's legacy as an absolute failure. As well as that one random NES game with the song that was really popular with the Japanese video game music remix community. Bit random, but hey, at least we've got one good thing to come from this game. Let's change things up a bit as we look at our only system for the day, and the only one that people still seem to generally like, with the PlayStation Portable, Sony's most successful foray into the handheld market owing to its great library, multimedia functionality, and actually being supported by Sony instead of dropped by them after only a couple of years like what happened with the Vita. In the end, it managing to sell around 80 million units, quite a distance away from its main competitor in the Nintendo DS, which sold almost double that with 154 million units, but still an incredibly impressive feat that puts it as the 12th best-selling game system of all time and the best-selling handheld not made by Nintendo. Which is honestly a bit of a miracle given how badly Sony kept biffing the marketing with the system. And to highlight how badly they could screw up, here's a quick lightning round of 3 different ad campaigns for the PSP that backfired horribly. First up, we have a line of ads featuring various creatures, which based on the art style and humor they were going for, seemed to have been an attempt to appeal to people who liked the online flash animations of the era, which didn't pan out due to a mix of it both reeking of Sony being desperate to be cool and hip, only to end up as the type of lame only an out-of-touch corporation can achieve, along with the fact that the slogans for the ads just didn't make any sense, describing the PSP as a nut you can play with outside, carpet you can watch outside, cheese you can listen to outside, or a lily pad with Wi-Fi. Whatever the hell any of those things mean. Long story short, these could be reworked as a passable Adult Swim bumper, but made for terrible commercials. Next up, we have the most embarrassing of these misfires with All I Want for Xmas is a PSP.com, a website that popped up around late 2006, which presented itself as a blog created by a pair of teenagers who, if you couldn't tell from the website's name, were trying to convince their parents to buy them a PSP for Christmas, complete with a rap song about all the specs and features of the system. Based on its presence here, and the fact that the supposed teenager looks like they're in their 20s, maybe early 30s, I'm pretty sure you can figure out that this whole thing was completely fake, with people eventually finding out the web domain was registered to an advertising agency called Zippertony, leading to a lot of backlash not only because of the questionable legality of them not disclosing this was an advertising ploy and not a real blog, but also because it was just really corny with the forced slang and other thinly veiled attempts to look young and hip. The last, and in my opinion, the worst of the bunch, was a billboard ad in the Netherlands that was done to promote a new color option for the system, namely white. The ad in question was captioned PlayStation Portable, white is coming, and depicted a white model threateningly holding the face of a black model. Yeah, unsurprisingly, Sony were forced to pull the ads and apologize after people ended up interpreting it as racist, especially when they seem to be implying that the white PSP is inherently superior to the black one. Make of that what you will. Luckily, after these stumbling blocks, Sony were able to recover, and whilst it never stood a chance going one-on-one with the DS, especially when Nintendo had the power of being able to sell the system to old people, the PSP still remains Sony's biggest success in the handheld market. Which admittedly isn't saying much when its only competition for that title are a Japan-exclusive PS1 accessory, a synonym for failure, and a retread of the Wii U gamepad, but still, you gotta take the victories where you can. For probably the most famous failure in this video, we've got Advent Rising, and the infamous contest that it was tied to. To give some background details, this 2005 action third-person shooter for the original Xbox was the passion project of brothers Donald and Jeremy Mustard, both of whom worked for a computer graphics design company called Glyphix, which mostly made promotional images and videos for other studios, with Advent Rising being the company's first foray into trying to make their own game. The Mustards having a lot of confidence with it, as they were not only hoping of making a trilogy along with a side game for the PSP, but this was also supposed to be the start of a multimedia franchise, complete with a comic book spin-off and tie-in novels. The game receiving an insane amount of marketing, the most notable and well-remembered being the Race to Save Humanity, a competition hosted via Xbox Live where the first player who could find a series of collectibles hidden throughout the game's levels would win $1 million. Despite all this hype, however, when the game actually released and people got to play it, it was hit with an overall reaction of meh. As despite the story and writing being generally liked by a decent chunk of the people who played it, it couldn't save it from all the technical shortcomings, namely with its large amount of bugs and glitches, some of which were fixed in a later PC release, along with some division over the game's targeting system, which has you auto-lock onto enemies by flicking the right control stick in their direction, but the game ultimately being a commercial failure that came nowhere close to being as good as it was hyped up to be, with Glyphic's first developed game also being their last, the company ultimately getting bought by Sandman Studios, with the title's publisher, Acclaim Entertainment, not only cancelling all future plans for the series, but also went through a corporate restructure to focus on budget and handheld games, with the Mustards ultimately ending up at Epic Games, where they would end up being key figures on the Infinity Blade series. Oh, and also this rather niche game you might not have heard of called Fortnite? Now, whilst all of this is fairly interesting, Advent Rising's legacy as a failure isn't so much remembered because of the technical hiccups or its plans as the next big sci-fi franchise falling through, but instead because of what ended up happening to that $1 million contest, which, much like the previously mentioned one for Action 52, was cancelled with no winner. However, unlike Action 52, which was screwed due to developer incompetence making it impossible to win, Advent Rising's contest was instead ruined by the people entering it, as the announcement of its cancellation was explained as being the end result of both Majesco and Xbox Live having, quote, determined there to be no technically feasible solution that would allow the contest to continue in a fair and secure manner. Or put in other terms, so many fake entries from hackers and cheaters had been submitted, all in pursuit of the $1 million, that there was just no logistical way of being able to tell who had legitimately won. Though this explanation hasn't stopped a popular conspiracy theory that suggests Majesco didn't actually have the $1 million to give away due to how much they lost on Advent Rising, and effectively used the hackers as a scapegoat to get out of giving the prize. Regardless of which series of events is true, the end result was the same. The contest was cancelled, and as a consolation prize, Majesco offered anyone who entered to pick 2 free games out of a lineup of 5 Xbox titles they had previously published, the selection consisting of Blood Rain 2, Guilty Gear X2 Sharp Reload, Psychonauts, Raises Hell, and Phantom Dust. Obviously, 2 free Xbox games doesn't really come close to being on par with $1 million, but hey, at least they actually did give something out, unlike the Action 52 devs. Plus, all those games are generally regarded as being just as good, if not better, than Advent Rising. So whilst massively disappointing, it wasn't a complete loss, which is something that can't be said for the last entry of this video. Let's end things off today with the many failed publicity stunts attempted during the final years of Acclaim. For anyone unfamiliar with them, which I wouldn't blame as it's a name that's mostly forgotten amongst modern audiences, they were a game publisher founded in 1987 by a group of former Activision employees, the company mostly being remembered as the studio responsible for the Turok series, along with publishing the home releases of some iconic Midway titles such as Mortal Kombat and NBA Jam, as well as the first 2 entries in Criterion Games' Burnout series. Whilst the company saw plenty of success during the 90s, by the time the 2000s started rolling around, they were running into financial troubles, mostly brought about from a mix of underperforming titles and various lawsuits, which ranged from the Olsen twins suing them for unpaid royalties, to Dave Mirra claiming they had damaged his image after what was supposed to be the 3rd game in the Dave Mirra Freestyle BMX series got turned into BMX XXX. So desperate for money and either not willing to invest or having the cash on hand to try and improve their output, Acclaim decided that the only way to bump up sales was to come up with some of the most bizarre and weirdest publicity stunts possible to garner attention from the general public. Now, ignoring the previously mentioned BMX XXX, which was basically just selling itself off of its sexual content, there were 5 games that each had a radical marketing stunt attached to them, which I'll cover in order of how much outrage there was towards them. Gladiator Sword of Vengeance, as part of a push by Acclaim that it was the bloodiest game ever made, had ads put up in UK bus stops that were installed with red dye cartridges that would open up and seep out of the poster and onto the streets, creating the illusion that it was bleeding, with cleanup crews reportedly being on site after the 6-day campaign came to an end. For the European PlayStation 2 release of Virtua Tennis 2, there was a plan to send out a swarm of pigeons with the game's logo painted on their wings in the middle of the 2003 Wimbledon Championships, though this never went beyond a press demonstration, likely due to the event having trained hawks specifically to stop pigeons from interrupting games, courtesy of Wimbledon's governing body, the Lawn Tennis Association. Turok Evolution had a campaign in the UK where Accolade were offering £500, an Xbox, and a copy of the game to 5 people as part of a lottery draw, in which entry required having your name legally changed to Turok. And whilst there were claims that thousands of people entered this contest, an investigation in 2020 would discover that all of the winners were actually paid actors who never went through with the name change. In addition, a similar offer was made in the US, where they were willing to give $10,000 to someone if they had a baby born on the game's release date and named them Turok. To promote Shadow Man's Second Coming, Acclaim offered to pay people if they were willing to put an ad for the game on their deceased family member's gravestone, with one spokesperson even going so far as to suggest that the offer might be appealing to poorer families. This prompted immediate backlash from the general public and the Church of England, who flat out refused to be a part of it, along with Matthew Carrington, the then chairman of the Outdoor Advertising Association, suggesting that even if someone did take them up on the offer, they likely wouldn't be able to do it anyway, due to it being illegal to put up any kind of outdoor advertising without planning permissions from the local authorities, regardless of if the grave was on public or private property. And finally, Acclaim promised to cover the costs of anyone in the UK that was caught speeding on the release date of Burnout 2. They ended up having to cancel this promotion after they received backlash on the fact that they were effectively making a crime legal and were incentivizing reckless driving for 24 hours, with most people agreeing that it's not worth putting lives at risk to promote a video game. In the end, all of these stunts ended up backfiring, as while some did make headlines, none of them really helped to sell any copies, and instead just further pushed the notion that Acclaim were long past their prime and were finding ways to somehow sink their reputation even lower than previously thought possible. Partially because of how negative the reaction to them was, but mostly because these over-the-top grabs for attention couldn't change the fact that most of the games they were being used to push were just bad, and no amount of panic over adverts on gravestones or bleeding bus stop posters were going to suddenly convince them to buy a game they already assumed was going to be crap, with Acclaim's utter inability to address the problems at their roots, ultimately leading them to file for bankruptcy in 2004, their assets being sold off to various other studios. We'll end things here for now, but I hope this has showcased that at the end of the day, no matter how hard you market something, how crazy you go with the competitions, campaigns, or advertising, you can't polish a turd. And if these kind of pushes backfire, it can not only bring the game down with it, but it might be the only reason your game is even worth remembering.